So today the stool that I'm going to be working on is inspired by a design by Frank Lloyd Wright, or should I say presumably by Frank Lloyd Wright, because it's in a lot of images from his Taliesin drafting school, and I have no idea whether he necessarily designed the stools or the drafting tables, but he has a tendency to design most of the furniture in his architecture, so it's a safe bet that he designed this. They're created in a few different ways, and I haven't been able to find any plans for them. I've just seen images of them in like the corner of pictures, none where they're even the focus of a picture. So I kind of worked from that and came up with a working plan that I constructed out of cardboard, and then I'm going to take this and use this as a kind of a rough guide to constructing this out of oak. I'm using oak for a few different reasons. One, because it's extremely strong for this cantilever that we have, but it's also pretty traditional for the arts and crafts, kind of craftsman style, and most people consider Frank Lloyd Wright kind of working in that vein. So I'm going to stick with that. I think it's going to look kind of appropriate for the stool, even though most of the images that I've seen of the stools in Taliesin actually appear to be constructed out of plywood. So I'm kind of elevating it a little bit and actually making it out of hardwood, and that allows me to change a few things about it. Like one of the things that you see in most of the images is there's like a web, an extra structure right here in this cantilever. But I think this cantilever kind of, this 90 degrees right here is really interesting, and it's one of the first things that drew me to this stool design anyway. And I think it's kind of muted a little bit by this extra piece that he has in the stools in Taliesin. So I went ahead and removed that. So when working with oak, it's going to be strong enough to actually support without that added. And this is going to be a through mortise and tenon. And I'm going to be doing that in a few different ways today. So I'm going to be sculpting it, not sculpting, but I'll be cutting it with hand tools and power tools. So yeah, we'll get a few different demos going today. And first things first, I need to start cutting. Alright, my first order of business with cutting my boards down to size for my stool is to create a cut list. This is just basically a guide to make sure you're getting the most out of your material. So I took all my measurements from my template and my plans, and then took note of the dimensions of my boards and made sure that I could get all the material that I need from the boards that I have, and that I wasn't going to waste material just because I did the wrong cut out of the wrong board. That's one of the things that you have to think about when you're working, especially with a variety of different sizes. This is 5 inches wide, and I have several boards that are 5.5 inches. So if I want a 2.5 inch cut, then if I cut one of those out of here, then I'll have this scrap material over to the side that is not going to be good for another 2.5 once you consider the curve, the amount of material that the blade takes off. So instead of using this for a 2.5 inch cut, I'm going to use this for a few of the pieces that are going to be 2 inches wide. So then that allows me to have enough room to lose a little bit and not have to waste an entire section of this board. So making a little bit of time and like actually making plans and producing a cut list, especially when you're working with a material that is not super expensive, but not really cheap either. It's good to conserve your resources and make sure you can get as much as you can out of the materials that you're working with. When I'm setting my table saw blade, I'm almost always setting it up where my teeth are going to be just one tooth above the stock that I'm cutting. So all my boards are ripped down and cut to length. So these are all the different pieces that I'm going to be using for the legs and the stretcher bars. Nothing's glued together yet. This is just a stack of individual pieces. I always kind of like this stage because it kind of feels like when you get your like a model kit or something and you open up all the pieces and you spread them all out and you get to see all the pieces before they're assembled first. It's just something really satisfying about that to me. Alright, I'm going to be laminating both of these up. Anyway, so I've got these lined up in the correct orientation and I'm going to be using a tight bond too. So I'm going to use this as my guide today to plan out my mortise and tenons. And you can see where the mortise and tenons are going to be going. So the tenons are coming along here and going down here. So the tenon is going to be connecting this foot to this, basically a cross brace that turns into another leg. So it's kind of a diagonal, basically leg of the stool. The cantilever and the way this is all formed together kind of leaves some of the terminology in the dust, so it kind of gets a little bit confusing. But the important thing that I'm going to be focusing on today is just making these mortises and tenons, so you can see how this entire process goes along. This mortise and tenon is at a 90-degree angle, so this is going to be a really good demonstration. And this is going to be applicable for any other type of mortise and tenon that you would be making, whether that be something for a skirt or an apron being attached to the legs of a table, or stretcher bars on chairs. This is the same exact process, and I'm going to do it two different ways today. I'm going to use some of the power tools in the shop, so you'll see that. You'll see me using the table saw with a tenoning jig and a mortiser in the shop that will actually drill the square holes. And then you'll also see me use a hand drill to drill out a lot of the material for mortise, and then I'll use a chisel to finish off that mortise. And then you'll see me cut the tenons by hand with a Japanese pull saw. So you'll see both of those ways of going about it today. Alright, now I need to just plan out all my cuts in the wood that I have stacked up here. This is all the wood that I'm going to be using for all the support structure. I also have another piece that goes in for the actual seat of the stool, but this is all the support structure right here. First thing I need to do is separate off all the pieces that I'm not working with today with the mortise and tenons. These are stretcher bars for the back of my stool, so I'm going to set those aside. And then I also have the main part that's going to be receiving all my mortises today, which is the kind of rear leg that turns into the kind of rear cantilever. So this goes into the kind of the rear foot of the stool, and then it goes all the way to the top. And both of these are going to be, it's going to be angled at the top and bottom, and there's going to be mortises coming in at a few different angles. The one that I'm going to be demoing today are two sets of mortises for this 90-degree angle here. When you get into the angled mortise, it gets a little bit more complicated, and I will be doing that as well, but that may not be in this video. We'll see how ambitious I get today. So this is the other one. At some point I'm going to have to commit to one side or the other, but at this point it doesn't really make much of a difference. Making sure I have the right pieces for the right parts. So yeah, there we go. So this is 15 inches. This is what I'm going to be doing at a 90-degree angle, and this is going to be a through tenon. So this is going to be going all the way through the through this piece, and then this is my rear support that's going to go up at an angle from here. So you can see on my cardboard that this foot and this rear support is going to be are significantly thinner, not nearly as wide of boards, and on the in oak, because the oak is just so strong. I don't really need to go as thick as what I did in the cardboard. So I'm going to be using the cardboard as just a generalized reference at this point. I'm going to I'll have to commit to one side or the other, and I think I'm going to commit to the back side as my guide, because that allows me to get further away from this inside edge. So that will give me a little bit more of a room to play with, so I don't have to worry about blowing out completely. So even though I'm making one of these by hand, I still want to use my mortising bit. This is my mortising bit, one of my mortising bits. I want to use this as a guide for not only the one that I'm going to use this for, but I also am going to use it as a guide for my other one, because I just want to make sure that that even though they're going to be done in two different ways, I want them to match and actually look good together. So I'm going to make sure I do it both ways with the same one. Alright. And making sure I pick out the bit that I actually want with each one. And I think this is going to be perfectly fine. This is a 1/2 inch bit. That's going to give me a pretty small shoulder, but I think I don't need a really big shoulder. So I'm setting my compound square right now so I can go around all the edges and draw a line just as a quick reference point. I'm also going to check that against my mortising bit just to make sure that I'm not completely crazy. Yep, that looks good. when you're cutting your joinery, you end up doing lots of marking and lots of double checking to get things correct. And it's always better to err on the side of too big than too small, because you can always take away more material, but you can put more material back, but it's easier just to shave off a little bit more. So I'm marking each one of these. I missed one section. Okay. So I have lines marked on either side to show the thickness of the shoulder that I'm going to be cutting away. But I also want to mark where my mortises are going to be going in here too. And I have my center point already marked. And now I need to set this up to show 1/4 of an inch off of that center point. So I'm going to take this to the center point, measure it, that's 3/4 of an inch. So to give myself a 1/2 an inch, I'm going to move this 1/4. Now I'm going to draw lines all the way around. And right now I'm still working in pencil. Here in a second I'm going to pull out a blade and actually trace a lot of this as well. But I'm working in pencil right now, partially just so I and you can see it. Normally when I'm doing demos in class, I'm doing it in pencils or markers because I want people to actually see it, so I guess I'm just in that habit. Alright, so now I have it marked out, so that should correspond nicely, and it does, with my 1/2 inch bit. So this is going to be drilling all the way through, or at least really close to all the way through. I'm only doing one side, so I think I'm just going to put a sacrificial board on here and then drill through. I'm also going to pick the side that I'm going to be drilling through. So when I'm lining up things on the mortise, on the mortiser, one thing to think about is blowout, and especially anytime you drill any holes, is when you're drilling all the way through a piece of wood, there's a good chance that as it gets really close to the edge, coming out the opposite side, there's a good chance that the blade, the bit is going to be pushing up against these fibers, and instead of just cutting the fibers, it's going to break the fibers, so it ends up breaking along the lines. That's one reason why we score everything with a knife before we do these cuts, or at least with a chisel, and score along your lines. So if it does bust out the backside and try to break the grain instead of just cutting it smoothly, usually those cuts are going to stop it. And another way to help stop that from happening is putting a sacrificial board behind the piece of wood that you're drilling into, so that board will help keep the wood from kind of splintering wide, so that board will help hold it all together. And also, as one more step of precaution, is planning appropriately for the piece of wood that you're cutting. So I know this is the inside of my joint, so this is where the shoulder is going to be situated on, so you won't actually see the very edge of the holes on this side, but you will see the edge of the holes on this side. So I'm going to want to transfer all these markings to this side, and when I drill through, I'm going to drill from this direction, so if by any chance I have a blowout where it wants to actually push through and break the grain on the opposite side, if it does it just a little bit, then it won't even be seen because the shoulder of the tenon is going to cover that up. But so all kinds of precautions, but that makes you a happy woodworker in the end when you don't have to clean up or try to cover up a mistake. Okay, I'm going to keep on making my markings. So here we are at the Mortiser. So this will look very similar to what you would expect out of a drill press. The big difference with this as opposed to a drill press is that the bits have two parts to them. So there is the outer sleeve that actually is the square bit, is a square part of the bit, and this is actually the part that makes the square hole. And this functions as a chisel working along the outside edge of the internal drill bit. So as the drill bit is driven into the wood and kind of guides the outer sleeve into it, then the sleeve slowly chips away all the corners of that hole. It requires quite a bit of force as you're actually pushing down. You'll notice if you're using this as opposed to a regular drill press, you have to work at it a lot harder to actually push down. If everything's sharpened pretty well, and you're working in a relatively soft wood, it's not going to be a huge amount of force. But if you're working in a harder wood and your bit's a little bit on the dull side, you'll have to be bearing into it pretty hard to actually get a really to actually progress the bit into the wood that you're working with. There's lots of ways to adjust this. You can change the bit size. So most of them are kind of a few different standard sizes. We have up to an inch in the shop. This is, I think this is a 3/8. We have a quarter inch, a half inch, a 3/8, and a full inch. So the one that I'm going to be using today is going to be a half an inch one. One thing to be aware of is that these are two separate pieces. So if I'm to release one of these by themselves, then this drill bit is very likely to drop down. And that's how most of these get dull, is by people not handling them appropriately. And you end up accidentally letting the internal drill bit fall out from the assembly, and then it hits the ground or bangs against a metal surface or something like that, and then it gets dull, or vice versa. This starts dropping, then you try to catch it, and then this one and the outer sleeve falls. So yeah, there's ways for this to go wrong. We have a few different things that we need to adjust here. We actually, just like a regular drill press, we have what's known as a Jacob's chuck up here that gets tightened onto the drill bit on the inside, and then this part down here allows you to tighten along the outside sleeve of the mortiser. So those are the two adjustments. I'm going to go grab our half-inch bit. So now we have our half-inch drill, half-inch mortising bit. There we go. This was set up for 3/8 beforehand, so I have to widen everything to actually bring this into play. Remember to make sure you're keeping your hands on all the different parts. It's not a bad idea to have a leather glove while you're going about this, just because you could accidentally poke yourself on some of these bits. I have pretty calloused hands at this point, so. All right, now I'm going to line up this with the backboard. The way I'm going to do that, I'm going to go ahead and move this down and then move this forward a little bit and just barely check and make sure that it looks like even spaces. I'm going to check it again when I actually align my wood on it, but I wanted to go ahead and do it right now too, just so it's not going to be too far off. Okay. So the actual drill bit part is in place, and my the square chiseling outer sleeve looks good as well. I'm going to check a few things. I want to make sure that I'm going to be drilling all the way through the wood that I'm going to be working with, and this is going to be my sacrificial piece of wood underneath, so I'm going to be drilling all the way through into this. So I want to make sure that this piece of wood is going to be at the bottom of what I'm connecting with. So back here is a stop block that will stop the blade from progressing any further. So the reason why you have a stop block is if you don't want to go all the way through the material that you're working with. And it also is handy so you just don't completely drill all the way through the even your sacrificial board. So I'm just setting the stop block a little bit lower than where it is now because it's not on, so I'm not really drilling into my sacrificial piece of wood yet. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and move that back, and now I'm going to go grab my piece and make sure, and I'm double checking to make sure this is the orientation that I want, and this is the orientation I want. I put X's to show all the negative space that I'm planning on removing, so I've crossed out where the mortise is. And just like any of the most of our other saws, we have a fence and a tabletop. And like the scroll saw, we also have a hold down. So this helps hold down the material because just the nature of the mortise of having to work that into your surface, and it's so tight inside the hole that you're creating. The hold down keeps the material from rising back up when you're trying to pull your bit back out. Depending on how thick the material that you're working with, you can orient the hold down either like this, where it's it's kind of in a L-shaped orientation, or you can flip it over and orient it this way as well. And that's what I'm going to do right now, because this is a little bit of a thicker piece that we're going to be making our mortises out of. So this is getting close. The thickness that I need to set up for my hold down also should include the sacrificial piece that's going to be underneath it. So I'm going to set it here and then go ahead and clamp that down. So this is still loose. I'm going to tighten this a tiny bit more before I do my mortise, but I want it to be a little free so I can move it around while I'm setting everything else up. The fence, there's knobs back here and clamp downs right here. So you can clamp these down and they'll lock the fence into place. And you need to do it on both sides so it doesn't accidentally pivot a little bit. And so I'm going to move this around to actually line up the mortise bit with my piece of wood right now. And this is going to be the second time I'm going to be checking the square of my mortise bit. So I'm bringing this down, and I could tell by my lines that it's slightly out of square. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen the outer sleeve of the mortise bit and twist it around a little bit to line up with my lines a little bit better. And I'm going to orient that closer and bring it down. It's looking good. I'm going to adjust it a tiny bit more. And once you make all your adjustments, then you can lock it all down and call it good. Alright, that looks good to me, so I'm going to go ahead and clamp this down so the fence won't have any chance of pivoting, and now you can't adjust it anymore. So that should be locked. I'm going to bring this down a little bit more and check once again just to make sure. Okay, I'm going to move it back a tiny bit more, and you can spend a while doing this kind of thing if you want to. Because there's so many minute kind of shifting, and when you clamp down your hold downs on either side, that kind of shifts it a little bit too. But that looks good to me. If you're doing a lot of these legs, especially if you're doing a normal like table leg into an apron, then one of the shortcuts that you can do is actually put stop blocks and everything in place, and then slowly like actually have a starting point, and then work your way down your leg that you're doing a mortise, especially if you have 4 legs like in a standard table. This I'm only doing in all honesty, I'm only doing 1 out of this. So the other ones I'm going to be doing are going to be out by hand in a different way. So I only have to set this up once, so I'm not going to worry about like keeping all of my settings exactly the same. So I'm just going to have to worry about setting it up once, and that's okay. Everything seems to be lined up right, and there's one thing that I still need to do, and so I'm going to leave all my settings exactly where they're at, but I'm going to go and mark all my lines with a chisel. So if I do have any blowout, that's going to reduce the chance of blowout from the grain actually splintering off from the sides. Normally I would go ahead and start sliding it further down, but I wanted to show we got a mortise through. So that's a square mortise at this point. Now it's a matter of just increasing that over and over again and adding a little bit more each time. And you'll notice while I'm doing this back and forth, every once in a while I will raise the blade back up as it's going down, the drill bit back up as it's going, pressing into the wood. I'll raise it back up just to release some of those wood chips so it doesn't get bound up and compressed down in there. So this is a mortise that was done with a mortiser. So this is relatively clean. It's extremely easy and not super time consuming. And it makes me very sad that I'm not going to get to do my next mortise this way. Okay, I'm going to lower my saw blade so the top of the saw blade is going to just be almost at the line, really close anyway. Lock that down, and I'm moving the saw blade around a little bit with a piece of wood just to make sure that I'm getting at the height that is actually the highest point. And now I'm going to line the saw blade with my line here. And I'm going to set up a stop block so every time I do this cut I can just flip it over, do the cut again, flip it over, do the cut again. So this is a tenoning jig. This is a really simple one. We have some big cast iron monsters in the shop as well, and a few other setups for this. And this is extremely simple. You just have to check all your angles. It's just made to sit on top of the fence. So it rides along the fence, which keeps it pretty darn straight up and down. And then you have another board screwed onto here or glued onto here, depending on the setup, that's going to be allowing you to actually put this at a 90-degree angle so you can move your bottom and slide it right in here and then sit this up, and then you can raise your saw blade up as high as you need, as long as your saw blade is high enough. So this one is going to work just fine, so I'm going to slide this forward a little bit. You cut your shoulders first. So you cut this part first, just so you can have something to actually be biting into. Okay, my mortise and tenon is getting really close. I've got a little bit of trimming I probably want to do. The real trick is to remove enough that it fits in, but not so much that it's going to be loose. Like right now, this is tight enough that I probably could beat it in. Like actually use a mallet to pound this in, and it would be a nice tight joint that would last for pretty much ever. But I want to be able to do a few dry fits and stuff, so I'm going to work at it a tiny bit more and shave off of high spots. And when I'm shaving off high spots, at this point I usually just forego the mallet altogether, and I just take the chisel and just very gently shave along the wood. and make sure I'm getting the high points. Terminology check: mortise, tenon, shoulder of the mortise, of the tenon. And that is pretty darn good. And that hole goes all the way through, and that looks good. I'm not going to keep working at it right at this moment because I don't want to, I know I could feel that it's going to keep on going in. And this is a deep enough tenon that I feel like if I pushed it all the way through right at this moment, there's a good chance that I'll have trouble getting it back apart again. And I want to be able to disassemble this before I do my final glue up. I want to have both of my tenons and both of my mortises cut. So I'm not going to really commit and push this through all the way yet because I'm afraid it's going to be hard to get it out without to actually do my glue up later. So that's the beginning of my mortise and tenon for this joint. So this is going to be the rear foot, and then this is going to be the front cantilevered. This seems like it's a little bit on the thin side, but plywood would be super strong for this, but this is also oak that is going to be really strong. So this is going to be plenty strong enough to resist that urge of wanting to break and that force there. And this through tenon going all the way through is going to be extremely strong. I was thinking about drilling 2 holes and putting little pegs in here as well, which I might do. I don't have it in any of my drawings. I think I made just a note that I might want to do that. That will be a nice little detail that will just be dependent on how I feel about the overall aesthetic when I get it to that point. But that would be, I would be adding that at the very end. So, but just something for me to think about. Cool. All right, for my next mortise, I'm going to be starting off with pretty much the same process as the last one. I have everything marked out already, have my X's marked. The next step I'm going to do is do the same thing where I'm going to mark along all my lines with a chisel. This is going to be just the beginning of a long, arduous amount of chisel work. I'm making it sound worse than it is. It's somewhat tedious, but it's not ridiculous. Lining up my chisel. So this is a 1/2-inch chisel that I'm working with right at the moment. So this is exactly the thickness that I'm going to be making my mortises out of. So I'm starting on those ends. Then I have just to connect the dots. I do have lines to guide me too. And I'm not really pounding it all the way in until I get the line established. Because I want this line to be clean. Okay, there's a few ways of drilling a hole all the way through a piece of wood. That seems like a really just obvious thing to say how to do. But there's a few tips and tricks depending on whether you're drilling all the way through a piece of wood or you're trying to stop part of the way through the wood. And I want to stop part of the way through this wood because I don't want to go all the way through, especially if I'm drilling with a bigger drill bit like this, a 1/2 inch drill bit. I don't want to go all the way through because I'm afraid I'm even with it scored and partially cut on the opposite side that I'm going to just remove too much material, and I don't want to do that. So there's a few physical ways of doing that. They sell stoppers that you can actually have on drill bits that can be tightened down. My typical solution is to set the drill bit where I want it to kind of be on here, and then hold my finger up against that, and then grab a piece of masking tape. This is super simple and kind of quick and dirty way of going about this, but I've used it for years and it doesn't let me down. And then I just put that tape on there, and then as I'm drilling my hole, once it reaches that tape, I know that that's as deep as I wanted it to go. And then I can keep on doing that over and over again, and that's reproducible. With this, I know my hole is in the very center of my board here. So my hole is in the very center, and I have a centering dowel jig here. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit of an easy way out here and use my centering dowel jig. And the reason why I like using something like this too is it keeps my drill bit going in straight, as opposed to as you're drilling in, you kind of have a tendency to wander a little bit. So it usually ends up having a shift in pitch at some point. So then you end up going to the side a little bit, and I want to try to avoid that, especially if I'm using such a big bit. I'm drilling into a 1/2 inch mortise with a 1/2 inch bit, so there's no room for wiggling. I could go for a slightly smaller bit, and that would be actually the smarter choice, and then clean it up. But I'm doing it this way because I want to save myself a little bit of time. We'll find out whether I regret that decision here in just a second. So I'm looking through my the 1/2 inch hole and making sure none of my current line is hitting it, and it's not, so I'm happy. So I'm going to go ahead and clamp this down. So I'm going to be doing this several times, and now I would still drill all the way through if I went down to the very bottom of this. So I'm still going to make note of how deep I want to go, and I'm going to mark that on here on the drill bit with the masking tape, but I had to take in consideration the thickness of my dowel centering setup here. So my masking tape is going to be significantly higher than it was just a second ago when I was showing you. The number one annoyance with this masking tape trick is the masking tape has a tendency to stick to the wood chips as you're drilling down. So be aware that sometimes the drill chips are going to want to pack into the drill bit a little bit more. So you'll want to get caught in the actual grooves in the drill bit and want to burn a little bit. So every once in a while, it's good to back out again. Make sure those are cleared, especially if you're drilling a deeper hole. Okay, I'm going to move this to a different clamp. You could use just a regular clamp like that, but I'm going to use my bench clamp here. So slow and steady, and I'm bringing it back up and down to remove that extra material. Alright, and I noticed my drill bit got a little bit loose. These drills are a little bit on the older side. And I completely released the wrong clamp. Perfect. Well, that makes me feel good. So my hole that I just drilled is perfectly centered in the mortise that I had already put into place. So that means my lines previously were really spot on in the first place. So that's great. That makes me feel good. Okay. So I'm going to just keep on going down the line, and then once I'm done with this line, then I'm going to flip it over, center it, and then finish drilling out the others. And then all those little bits in between drill bits, I'm going to have to clean that up, and I'm going to just do that with a chisel and pound that out. Okay, here is the next tenon that I'm going to be cutting. This, I've gone ahead and highlighted it with a Sharpie just so you can see kind of the outline. These are going to be really small shoulders that I'm cutting out. So I'm going to be cutting really thin stuff here. So I'm going to go ahead and just use a Japanese pull saw, just because that will allow me to get some of these delicate cuts. And I may or may not be able to get all the way through without starting to accidentally pitching the saw blade a little bit, because it's really hard not to do that. And if I start doing that and I see myself progressing past my line at all, then I'll stop, back out, and do a release cut into the side to actually free up that piece and either start again, or I'll, depending on where I'm at, I might just finish it off with a chisel. But the first thing I'm going to do isn't try to follow the line straight down right here. I'm first going to do a release cut on all the sides, just as deep as this, just so I don't, as I'm removing the side materials, I'm not going to accidentally break in and then chip off my saw blade. You could score all this with a knife beforehand, and I probably should do that, but I'm gonna do it just with a saw. So I'm starting at a slight pitch whenever I'm doing a really straight cut like this. So I'm creating my line right on at the front initially, and then I'm going to start on the back side, so I'm pitching it back now. And now I'm going to connect those two lines. And even for a cross cut, this saw works so well. It only takes a few seconds to get to where I want it to be. So this video was the part one of putting together my mortise and tenons. My 90-degree mortise and tenons for my stool are cut. So I have my 90-degree ones prepared to assemble. This one's hand cut, this one's machined. And they want to go in, take a little bit of tapping, and they would go straight away in. But I don't want to do that just yet, because we have two other mortise and tenons that I have to cut for my stool, and it's much easier to do that while it's all disassembled. So the next piece that I'm making is this, and this is going to be, I think this is running at right at 40 degrees. So anyway, the angled piece, so this piece is going to be running in this orientation from the others. So this is going to be a mortise cut at an angle, just like the tenon is cut at an angle. And trying to do all this assembly, to do all this cutting while it's a piece of it's already assembled, would just be a bad idea. It would just be a lot more work. So I'm going to go ahead and start cutting my mortise and the rest of my tenons. So this stool overall is going to have 4 tenons And then it's also going to have a few lap joints like these right here. So it's going to have lap joints running along the back side and the front of it. So you can see it here in my cardboard model. Has these lap joints and the sides. And that's these pieces right here. They're going to be the lap joints. So a little bit more work to do. So that's why this is going to be 2 parts, so you can actually see the full stool come together. But that's an initial process for creating the mortise and tenons.